pass over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk. It's great to be part of this group and to see some old friends and familiar faces. So I'm going to be talking about identity, I suppose, at Çatalhöyük. And in many ways, Çatalhöyük seems to be an obvious place to try and explore questions of identity, because there's so much evidence of what appears to be direct insight into people's lives and identities. For example, we have plastered skulls that I suppose, well, certainly when we were excavating it, I had a very strange sense of looking into the face of a Neolithic person. Of course, that's really not a justified statement, but nevertheless, one had that sort of sense. And I particularly find this figurine fascinating because I feel that looking at the face, one's seeing a real person, a real individual person. It's a beautifully sculpted figurine or statuette, and one gets a sense of a real person that's being represented there. And then, of course, there are lots of ways that one can sort of touch people in the past. We have these handprints on the walls where you can see the fingerprints and the finger detail. Or in the bottom left here, this is a floor on which you can see the way the fingers have radially smoothed out the plaster floor. So you have a sort of sense, of course it's a sort of an imagined sense, but nevertheless you have a sense of being in touch and being able to get at individuals at Çatalhöyük. But I guess I've always, well, perhaps all of us tend to see identity as something that you have or you don't have, that it's something that you're sort of born with, or that you build, and it's a sort of fixed, it's a relatively fixed thing. Although of course we all know that you tend to express different identities to different people and in different contexts. So we know it's sort of contextual, but I've never really sort of developed the idea that identities were something that had to be built through a life at Çatalhöyük. And so that's what I'm going to try and do by following through the stages of life and seeing to what extent people were incorporated into an identity during that process. So one can start talking about identity really before birth. We have quite a number of preterm baby burials, and so we can look, if you like, at the way those preterm babies are treated and so on. But here's just one example of a woman, and I don't know if you can see here in the middle here some very small bones, and this is the skull here of a baby that has got stuck in the pelvis during birth. And so we think this woman died in childbirth and then had her head removed. So we can start to talk about the process of birth, which must have presumably often have been difficult and dangerous. We also have quite a large number of very young babies that are buried in a range of different sorts of contexts. And it is fascinating that many of these baby burials, often in baskets, as in this one down here, that these baby burials seem to be being placed in buildings as part of foundation practices. And in this particular case here, you have a series of babies that are buried right in front of the threshold. These are two sort of entrances from this side room into the main room. And this sort of pattern of burials in thresholds is found in a number of other buildings. or the baby burials are found as part of the process of founding in various other ways. Kevin Kay has written an interesting article fairly recently where he argues that quite a large number of the baby burials occur in relation to parts of buildings that are collapsing, so that it's almost as if the baby burial is shoved under a wall in order to prevent it collapsing. That's his argument at any rate. It's a sort of an active role for the baby in supporting and sustaining the house. The baby burials are really very, very fascinating at Çatalhöyük. And part of this has come from the study by Mehmet Somel and his team at METU on the ancient DNA at Çatalhöyük. Nearly all of the individuals from which they have obtained genomic data, so it's about 130 individuals, 130 genomes, nearly all of them are babies. And I'll come back to the question of why that is later on. But it does mean that when we're looking at, say, this is in comparison with other sites, but here if we're looking at Çatalhöyük, we have babies buried in the house. And what we find is that the vast majority of the babies buried in the house have no relatives in the house. That there are some that are as part of a sort of family group, but many of the people, and this is more than at Barchin and Boncuklu and Ashikla. So other Neolithic, earlier and contemporary sites where there are really, at Çatalhöyük anyway, really a high proportion of babies that are buried and placed in a house, even though they're not related to anybody in the house. And so one sort of one interpretation of this, I suppose that our dominant interpretation is that the babies are fostered or adopted out and are placed in other buildings, other houses, as part of creating social relations within the community as a whole. So we have a situation where you have lots of babies in the house. Many of them, of course, are being still breastfed, and so we're looking at babies and their mothers. And if we look at the dietary evidence, what we find is that on the whole, if you look at the carbon and nitrogen evidence, that many of the buildings have very clustered pattern of diet. You can see these sort of tight clusters. So it's not always the case, but many of them have tight clusters. And what's interesting then is that we have a situation where you have the people buried in the house have the same diet, the mothers and the children have the same diet, but they have different genes. So it seems fairly clear that women were wet nursing unrelated individuals, that women would be providing milk to their biological offspring as well as other genetically unrelated people. So it's a really fascinating process. And it may be that part of the reasoning for this is in order to prevent the nuclear family, becoming an important factor at Çatalhöyük. And I found some ethnographic evidence which suggested that this type of adopting and mixing and moving around of babies is part of an attempt to create egalitarianism, to try to prevent individual families becoming dominant. But it's also possible that what's going on here is that you have as in many societies, that children, very young babies, are not yet named and not yet really seen as fully part of society. And so in this sort of liminal period, it may be that it was thought acceptable for babies to be moved around into different households, where they would then gradually become part of society. So it may well be the case that when you're born at Çatalhöyük, you're not really fully part of society, and that you only gradually become a person through a process of incorporation. And that incorporation process we can follow through quite nicely. because it's the case that quite a lot of babies have various types of stuff placed with them in baskets or in mats and with a range of beads and shells and color and pigment and so on. And you can see an anklet on this little baby here. But we can. I've tried to sort of summarize. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about the way that all this develops, and how the socialization process emerges, how a person is made. So I'm just trying to rearrange my screen so I can see the whole screen. So at the top here, there are the categories that the human remains team working at Çatalhöyük has been able to divide skeletons into. So we have preterm, as I mentioned, then neonates, which is up to the first 2 months, infants up to 3 years, children 3 to 12 years, adolescents up to 20, then young adults, middle adults, and old adults. And then we have a sort of more general category of just greater than 20. And if we look at how people are treated in these different, so we have about 800 burials, so it allows us to try and do this. So for preterm babies, they often occur in baskets, and then where they occur is really interesting. So at Çatalhöyük, there's a very clear pattern. The side rooms here, these side rooms of them, and then the southern area of the main room are quite distinct from the northern and eastern areas. The northern and eastern areas are where you get most of the adult burial and where you get most of the art and installations, the bull's horns and so on and so forth. So sorry, lost there. These floors are white, very carefully cleaned areas. Very carefully respected and cleaned, and the paintings and so on are normally around this area. Whereas this area here to the south and the west is where you get food production, tool production. We have what we call dirty floors because they allow refuse to build up in these areas, storage and so on. Sort of productive area. And it's interesting then that the preterms, and as we'll see, neonates and infants tend to the younger individuals tend to be buried in this sort of south, in this western and southern area. So they're not fully incorporated. Incorporated is in these northern and eastern areas. They're not fully incorporated spatially into the house, and they occur in baskets. But by the time they're 1, weaning starts. This is work of Jessica Pearson on the isotopes. Weaning starts, and by 2, you start to have beads becoming more common, and beads become something that's found increasingly through time. So both in the sense of not being part of society, in the sense of not being in the sort of northern and eastern area of the site of the house, and in terms of beads, children are gradually incorporated into society, anklets and bracelets. Then if we get into the children category, 3 to 12 years, we shift from baskets to mats and shrouds. We have more evidence of beads. Breastfeeding seems to stop by about 3. Adolescents, now we find them increasingly found in the north and east main platforms. So they're shifting, they've been moved into the sort of the main social categories. And I'm not going to talk about this blunt force trauma, but it's the fact that you get adolescents with this trauma on their heads suggests again gradual incorporation into adult life. And as we go on through time, we get more beads, usually as necklaces, more tools buried with young adults. And this is when we also get less good preservation, DNA preservation. And I'm saying that because we're fairly clear that at Çatalhöyük we have very bad preservation of adults. As I said, most of our data are from babies, but and young people. But but the number of the survival of adult DNA is very, very poor. And we're fairly sure that this is because of the way bodies are treated. We think there is something what we call delayed burial, which means that after death, there's a fairly long process of treating the body outside a grave. And that process led to less good preservation. And so, yeah, so adults have this less good preservation. And also we find through time, not only increasing numbers of beads and necklaces, but also changing diet, especially older males. And of course, teeth caries increases with age. So there are, we can see through this process then a number of ways in which children or individuals are gradually incorporated into society by the way they are placed in the house, by the number of beads that they're found with, and by the changing diet and the changing way in which the bodies are treated after death. Just to show you here, this is an example of this transformation of diet through time, that if you look at this, the nitrogen and carbon for young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults, you can see that the young adults tend to be towards the left in this diagram and not so much towards the right. So there's a sort of shift, a gradual shift through time, particularly in terms of the carbon signature. But as this process of gradual incorporation into society occurs, we seem to also see a gradual divergence in terms of male and female. On the whole, and I've written in a number of places over the years, men and women are very, very similar in the way they're treated. And I've often argued that men and women, that gender, if you like, was sort of blind at Çatalhöyük. It didn't really matter whether you were a man or a woman, the way you were treated. There's lots and lots of evidence that men and women have similar lives, similar diets, similar activities, and that both of them have their heads removed, which is a sign of status and so on. But more recent evidence has shown a lot of nuance, and it's clear that I was wrong about this. And there are overall, while there are similarities in diet and activity and burial location and numbers and types of beads and caries and head removal and so on, there are also some distinctive differences. One of these is that, as we've seen, infant, child, and adolescent males have got better DNA preservation than older people. We're now absolutely sure that it's a matrilineal, matrilocal society. So unlike much of the evidence from Neolithic Europe, Central Anatolia, certainly at Çatalhöyük anyway, has a very strong signature of matrilineal matrilocality. The terminology is sort of different, but what I mean by this is that lineage seems to be clearly counted through the woman in the Çatalhöyük burial practices. We also find that beads and necklaces are slightly more common with females. There are some slight activity differences between men and women, with women having more evidence of squatting and men more evidence of throwing these rather nice obsidian spearheads and so on. This blunt force trauma on the heads is more common amongst young males, and there is more evidence of male mobility through time. Women, on the other hand, live longer than men, and women particularly seem to be associated with this sort of this putting on of fat or weight, which occurs only in the upper levels at Çatalhöyük, but is a distinctive thing that is associated with women. And a number of people who've written about this have suggested that what you can see at Çatalhöyük is a shift from the bull in the earliest layers as a sign of status, so that, you know, the number of bull's horns and things that you have is an indicator of the house status. Whereas towards the end of the occupation, it seems to be these women who are showing their success in life, not necessarily just reproductive success, because these seem to be women in later stages of their life with drooping breasts and buttocks and so on. So we think these are sort of successful older women, and the success of the household is shown through these matrilineal, matriarchal type sort of individuals. Just to give you some sort of visual indication of these differences between men and women. So this is taken mainly from the art, looking at what men's equipment looked like, what men looked like, and the bearded, the necklaces, the leopard, sort of leopard headdress and cloths and so on. And anyway, all these details are something that we have evidence for men. And for women, a particular distinctive hairstyle, which is a sort of circle on the head where you put the hair around it, and particular types of garment that you can see here, necklaces as well, and probably body painting or body stamping or scarification or some sort of bodily decoration as well. Here in the middle, you have a representation of these items stuck to the clothing, and this is trying to represent these boar tusks that were found in a female grave. There's actually one of the interesting things about identity at Çatalhöyük is that there's a lot of highly idiosyncratic behavior, so that many burials, many graves seem to show individuals who do something unusual or unique, or, for example, nobody is ever buried with animals, but there is one burial where someone is buried with a sheep, and so that type of idiosyncratic behavior is quite common. This is a beautiful, beautiful necklace. Again, really very idiosyncratic. There's only one example, anything like this, made out of interlocking, beautiful interlocking, very clever bone beads. But again, one of the fascinating things about the bead evidence from Çatalhöyük, studied by Milena Vasic and various other people, is that when you look at all the necklaces, what you find is that very often the amount of wear on the beads varies within one necklace, and it seems to be possible to argue that necklaces were put together from beads with lots of different histories. And this is a sort of form, and of course it's possible that these necklaces were only really made for burial, and it's possible that people were gifting beads in the burial context. But whatever the particular context is, it's just really possible to imagine that one's identity was very much based on the exchange of beads between people. And of course, there are these anthropological ideas of distributed personhood, that by giving of oneself to others, one creates a sort of distributed sense of self. I don't want to push that too far, but it is. I do find it fascinating the way in which one can almost talk about beads as being like a currency, a cowrie shell type situation where you're passing beads around as part of the building of relationships between people, so that your identity is very much distributed and dependent on these relationships that you build. Another aspect of personal ornament that I find fascinating is these finger rings. This is not a fishhook, we think, but a clothing item. But these finger rings with long protuberances are really quite distinctive, and what this makes me think is that it would be very difficult to do very much with these. That they sort of make daily activity difficult. And so it seems to me to support the idea that maybe there were some individuals at Çatalhöyük who, at least during part of the time, um, were expressing were focusing on their identity and status rather than being involved in work. And it may be that there were certain people who were able to be um, uh, were able to exist without depending on their personal labor, but were more representative of the group or the house or whatever, rather like the sort of fatness of women, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, then there's the question of the famous Çatalhöyük mirrors, and I guess I had always tended to think of these as something to do with uh, looking into the future, magic, shamanism, something of that sort. But recently, looking at the evidence, it seems possible that they are actually something to do with looking at oneself and looking at makeup and so on. And that's because they're often found with shells which have color pigment in them, and or with bone tools that seem to be in that could and spoons, so shells and spoons and bone points that have color on them and suggest that they were involved in personal maquillage and decoration and so on and so forth. So quite a sort of elaborate process of making one's face up or making oneself up in some ways. I'm not arguing that all of these bone tools on the top left here are for that purpose. They may have been for eating and other things, but there does seem to be a sort of a set of equipment that is involved in personal painting and ornamentation. So I hope I've tried to show there how through a life, beginning very early, people gradually get incorporated into society and build an identity through a long process that gradually bifurcates in terms, at least to some degree, in terms of age um, and gender. But at Çatalhöyük, it's very clear that identity doesn't end there. The persons continue to exist well after death, well after what we are defined as death. And as I mentioned earlier, we clearly have evidence of delayed burial, perhaps smoking or drying out, or even the old idea of vultures pecking off flesh. All these ideas seem to be back in the realm of possibility nowadays. For certainly quite a long chunk of time between death and burial, and then the burial itself goes through a series of steps, so that first of all you have the primary burial of the dried out, whatever it is, body, a primary burial beneath the floor of the house. And then that burial often gets disturbed, so what we call primary disturbed burials. And then parts of that body or all the body may be taken and placed somewhere else in another grave. So you have sort of secondary burial of skulls, but also of arms and legs and whole bodies, sort of them moving around the circulation of bodies. And then by tertiary, I mean that gradually there seems to be a process of forgetting whereby uh, skeletons get dug up and get incorporated into the matrix of the mound, so that we find small pieces of human body everywhere, in plaster, in bricks, it becomes part of the matrix of the mound. And presumably at that point, or clearly at that point, the individual personhood, the individual person has been forgotten. And so there seems to be, I'm not sure that we can say right at the moment how long this process is of forgetting, and I presume it varies from individual to individual, but certainly quite some time is involved in this process. So this is one of the burials at Çatalhöyük that shows a primary burial of a woman holding a secondary burial, if you like, the plastered skull of another woman. And there's a lots of evidence that certainly by the time you get secondary burial, that there is clear memory going on. This is a remarkable burial found in Building 5 at Çatalhöyük, which is very, very secondary. You can see the way the axial, the spine has been packaged in with other bones into a real bundle. And underneath that bundle, we find an amazing array of very beautifully made obsidian points and knives, skull, and this absolutely exquisite mace head. So for Çatalhöyük, this is amazingly rich burial that's placed at the beginning of the life of a new building, perhaps to start off that building. But clearly, this is an example of memory making in some sense. This fascinating figurine again shows this process, if you like, of life and death, the process of changing from one to the other, with the sort of fully fleshed woman at the front and the skeletal remains and scapulae and pelvis and so on at the back. This transformation, and that you can't really see that, but there's a hole in the top so that you could take the head in, and you could take the head and put it in and out. And that's quite a common thing at Çatalhöyük. So there's sort of reenactment, the reenactment of the process of secondary engagement with the human body. So I've tried to sort of talk about this arc, this process from prior to birth, through birth and into early life, the gradual incorporation into society, division male and female, the death and the continuity of life through death, where they're clearly still the case that individuals are seen as having some sort of identity through time. But this sort of process of transformation of life into death and death into life is in a way parallels with evidence for a continuity with the animal world, that the identity of a human is also porous or translatable into other identities, either through a shamanic process or whatever, but some sort of process of transformation. And what I'm building this on is quite a lot of imagery that one wonders what exactly it is. Are we talking about a human here or an animal? So these famous splayed figures at Çatalhöyük, Mellart thought they were human females, but we're absolutely certain that they're bears, and that's because of a stamp seal that we found that very clearly shows a bear's head. All the examples, the relief examples in houses, have all had their extremities, their feet and hands, and the skull and the head removed, so it's difficult to know what they were. But many of them have swollen bellies. Quite a number of them have swollen bellies and navels. And I'm no expert in what a naked bear looks like, but I did look it up a little bit, and it's very, very difficult to see the navel of a bear. And so it's possible that there's an ambiguity here between a sort of human and animal form of some sort. It may be that there are other resonances, and splayed figures like this with the feet upwards are found in southeast Turkey in relation to more frog-like or serpent-like imagery. So it's difficult to know what this is, what it's blending together. But it seems possible to argue that it has a human and some non-human components to it. The same is true of this one. I mean, we've spent hours, or I spent hours anyway, trying to look at this and decide whether it's a human or a cat or a leopard or a bear or a, I don't know. Anyway, we've been through a whole series of different possibilities. The beautiful thing with obsidian eyes that was placed looking into the storage room entrance in a building. But I think the ambiguity is maybe the point that it is something that's both human and animaloid in some sense. This is one of my favorite artifacts from Çatalhöyük, and it shows it's a pot that shows on the ends a human face, and on the sides a bull's head. There's the bull's skull here, and there's horns, and I should say properly cattle, a cat, and the ears, and then it's very evocative the way the bulls or the cattle horns come up like this, and can almost function as eyebrows to the human face. So it seems there's humans at both sides and cattle on both sides in this pot, and yeah. So it's one can, as you turn it around, you get this transformation between the bull and the human. There's lots of these things on the top here, top and bottom left. And the figurine team at Çatalhöyük ended up calling these abbreviated because they couldn't really decide what they were. I'm against the run of general opinion. I think they look bird-like, and so I would like to suggest that they have some sort of bird-like function, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, they seem to be, they perhaps don't have any human aspect, but I would like to think that they do. Certainly the one on the bottom left seems to. And these are very quickly made and in vast numbers of these sorts of things. And of course that then recalls the evidence from the wall paintings of vultures with human feet, suggesting people getting dressed up as vultures and transforming into vultures. And that idea has been elaborated by Rissa Russell in her work on the bird bones at Çatalhöyük, where she argues that some of the crane bones indicate that the wings were attached to some sort of structure, so that they could be worn. This is a reconstruction of this by her of that sort of evidence. So again, sort of humans transforming into non-human forms, as is very, very common in shamanistic type practices, and is a very distinctive aspect of all the symbolic imagery, or not all of it, but a lot of the symbolic imagery from Southeast Turkey and the Taştepeler sites. And then, of course, there's the suggestion, the evidence that these depictions of humans at Çatalhöyük are wearing leopard skins in some way. So this has always been the argument that these spotted things around the waist indicate leopards, and people perhaps dancing as leopards, becoming leopard dancers, or pretending to be leopards. So you have this example here of somebody apparently jumping on the back of a wild boar, or no, this is a bear, I think, sorry, jumping on the back of a bear in a sort of leopard-like perhaps way. This notion of becoming a person and being able to move between different sorts of identities, perhaps within the context of trance and dance, but whether that's part of it or not, there does seem to be an interesting way in which one can talk about that type of transience. So I've been talking almost entirely about individual identity and the way that can be seen as a process of change, depending on context. But I just want to very briefly say something at the end about the collective and group identity. We have a huge amount of evidence of this, and I don't want to sort of belabor the point. I'm just going to mention a couple of issues that I think are really clear. So in summary, the sort of group, the main group that one identifies with at Çatalhöyük does seem to be the house. And there's just lots of evidence of a house scale of production. And when I say a house, I mean both the individual house like this and the house with it within a capital H, which means a number of houses that are grouped together in relation to a more central house. So people seem to identify with these houses, and as we've seen, they gradually are incorporated into the house. So if you die young, you're buried in these sorts of areas over here, and gradually through your life, you'll have more chance of being buried in these cleaner and whiter platforms over here with more symbolism and stuff. There's lots of evidence also that houses are stacked on top of each other with memory making going on, so that this particular house might refer back to the house below it. And there may well be some genetic links between some of the people living in the house and some of the people buried beneath. But remember that many of the people who are living in the house and eating together are not genetically related, but some of them are, and this goes through time. So a house is related to the house below it, despite the fact that many of these relationships are not genetic. They are something that are socially constructed. But there's just lots of evidence then that one of the most important identity groups is the house and the group of houses. But it's also clear that houses are not independent. They're very dependent on each other in all sorts of ways, exchange and the movement of human bodies, as we've been talking about. But one of the most obvious ways that we see this is again work by Kevin Kay, who takes a particular building like this, building 59, and he's looking at the steps through time on the Harris matrix. So it can have up to, in this case, 130 or so, 125 steps in the Harris matrix. So these are time related. We don't necessarily know how long each section is of time, but we know that we have all these steps. And so we can sort of look at whether we have particular traits in the house through this sequence. And in this case, we have the elaboration of symbolism through time. We have a burial at the beginning, but there's no burial later on. But what I want to point out is that there is a period where there's no hearth oven and no hearth. And that we find that quite often, and it suggests that people are sharing food between houses. And we already see in the dietary evidence, which shows that the people buried in a house, which may be people buried in from the whole group of houses, that is a house with a capital H, that all those people are eating together and sharing food. So some sort of sharing of food is important between and amongst houses. We also have a lot of art evidence of something going on beyond the house, and perhaps not at Çatalhöyük itself. It's difficult to see whether it would be possible to do many of these activities on the roofs at Çatalhöyük, and so I presume many of these activities take place outside the confines of the settlement itself. But certainly the art seems to show groups of people doing things like dancing or teasing and baiting wild animals and so on as groups, as collective, and often they seem to have some sort of dance type aspect to them, so some sort of larger grouping. It's difficult obviously to see these sorts of things archaeologically, but the work done by those that are listed here has focused on the size of feasting remains. So looking at collections of animal bones that seem to be the product of feasting practices. And if one looks at the size of these collections of bones, the suggestion is that that feasting often may involve up to 100 people, but not very often more than that. That many of the feasts are fairly small scale, but nevertheless there are practices, there are events where larger numbers of up to 100 people or a bit more do come together as part of a feasting practice, and maybe some of that dancing and other things go along with it. But it's interesting to ask. So there are a whole series of rules at Çatalhöyük about how you lay out a house, where you put things. I've shown you this sort of pattern of the south and the west area and the north and the east area of the house. There are all these sorts of rules. So that suggests that it may be difficult to incorporate new people. So when you're looking at a scene like this, was it possible for anybody just sort of to turn up and become part of the Çatalhöyük community, particularly since it does seem to have been so much a matter of practice and process? Was it possible for anybody to come in and become part of this process? And so how inward looking and how closed off was Çatalhöyük to the outside world? And one of the ways that we can look at that is in terms of the strontium isotopes that Jessica Pearson has been studying. And what you can see here on this diagram that she's produced is that by far the vast majority of people at Çatalhöyük have a local signature, a local diet signature, or a local livelihood signature. That's on the immediate area around the plain. Sorry, around the site on the Konya plain. But there are about 10 individuals. I think she studied over 100, but about 10 individuals that are sort of seem to have spent part of their lives anyway, part of their lives away from Çatalhöyük. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at where these people were buried. And we got a really fascinating result that all of these people who are not in the local group, all of these other outsiders, if you like, all of these outsiders are not found in the main houses. They're all in very marginal houses, and most of them are in this southern and western area where, if you remember, is where the babies and so on were buried. And so it seems to be the case that outsiders were allowed in, but only in a limited way, and that there was a process whereby they were kept as outsiders within the house itself and not incorporated into these main important platforms. So that suggests a society in which there is a very strong sense of group identity, the group of itself as a whole, which, as I said, is seen very, very clearly in the way that the house itself is constructed. I think we excavated about, and know about from Mellart's work, about 300 houses. There's only one in the main period of Çatalhöyük where you don't have the hearth and the oven in the south side of the house. So there's a very, very strong rule that you have to have the hearth and the oven on the south side of the main room. And so there are these very, very strong rules. It's in many ways an inward-looking society. It seems to be endogamous and to produce its own population from within itself. So an inward-looking, fairly closed society, the one that is not very welcoming to outsiders. And we also see this in terms of, there are a few individuals from Çatalhöyük who are disabled, who are disabled in life. And they again were not buried in these, actually some of them are not buried in houses at all. There are very few burials not in houses, and these include these disabled individuals. So perhaps a society that was fairly, as I said, closed and very unwilling to accept strangers, outsiders coming in. Very strong inward-looking identity. A lot of individuality and idiosyncrasy within the society, despite the strong rules, but still one that was very strongly adhered to. So I hope that gives you a sense of identity and personhood at Çatalhöyük. And it's always very difficult to give talks about Çatalhöyük because the work that I'm talking about is based on the work of a very, very large number of people who came together over 25 years, and it's difficult to stop selecting people out. But I'm enormously grateful to the team that worked together at Çatalhöyük and to the sponsors and supporters who made our work possible. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm just going to stop the recording.